September 11, 1944, in the airspace over central Germany. American bomber formations approached through scattered clouds, their massive fighter escort glinting in the afternoon sun. On airfields below, Luftwaffe controllers scrambled hundreds of fighters to intercept the raid. The German pilots climbed toward the approaching armada, many of them barely out of training school, some with fewer flight hours than it took to properly learn their aircraft. What followed was slaughter. By day's end, more than a third of the German fighters that engaged the enemy had been shot down. Those who made it back landed on airfields lined with rows of brand-new aircraft, dozens of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, sitting silent in their dispersal areas with cold engines and empty cockpits. This was the paradox destroying the Luftwaffe from within. Germany's factories were producing fighters at unprecedented rates, yet the skies over the Reich were emptying of German aircraft. The assembly lines worked faster than ever, but the training schools had collapsed. Germany was building thousands of warplanes that would never fly in combat because there was no one left who knew how to fly them. The numbers told a story that defied logic. In 1944, German aircraft production reached its wartime peak, with September alone producing more than 3,800 aircraft. Of these, 80% were fighters. Albert Speer's reorganization of German industry had achieved what many considered impossible under constant Allied bombing, dispersing production into underground facilities and streamlining manufacturing processes. The factories had aluminum, the workers maintained their stations, and the assembly lines kept their rhythm despite the chaos enveloping Germany. Month after month, new aircraft accumulated faster than combat could deplete them, yet this production miracle meant nothing because Germany had run out of trained pilots to fly them. The irony was particularly bitter because the Luftwaffe had once possessed the world's finest pilot training system. Before the war, German pilots underwent comprehensive programs that appear to have provided well over 200 hours of flight time spread across multiple stages of instruction. The Hitler Youth's Flieger HJ units introduced boys to aviation fundamentals through glider construction and basic flying, creating a pipeline of aviation-ready recruits who entered the Luftwaffe with foundational knowledge their Allied counterparts lacked. By the time war began, the Luftwaffe fielded pilots with years of experience and well-defined tactical doctrine. The men who fought the Battle of Britain in 1940 were products of this system, veterans with 3 or more years of flying experience who could execute complex maneuvers and coordinate attacks with precision. German aces accumulated kill counts that shocked Allied intelligence services, with several pilots credited with over 100 victories by war's end. This superiority stemmed not just from individual skill, but from systematic training that produced consistently excellent pilots. The training system's collapse began with Operation Barbarossa's launch in June 1941. The massive scale of the Eastern Front campaign created pilot attrition the Luftwaffe had never anticipated. During the first 6 months of the Russian offensive, German aircrew casualties from all causes in all theaters totaled approximately 2,200 men, with the second 6 months producing an almost exactly equal number of losses. This steady bleeding of experienced pilots placed unprecedented demands on the training organization, which had been designed to produce aviators for a victorious air force rather than to constantly replace casualties in a grinding war of attrition. The Battle of Britain had been the Luftwaffe's first major setback, but the service had managed to replace those losses by drawing on existing reserves. Russia proved different because the losses never stopped and the reserves eventually ran dry. The training organization suffered direct assaults as well as gradual erosion. In early 1942, the German airlift operations to resupply cutoff forces at Demyansk and Cholm required transport aircraft the Luftwaffe did not have in sufficient numbers. The solution was to strip Junkers 52 transports from C schools and blind flying schools, along with their instructor pilots who were desperately needed to fly the dangerous supply missions. Many of these instructors and aircraft never returned to training duties because frontline units were short of experienced pilots and commanders diverted resources wherever they were needed most. The simultaneous campaigns in North Africa and the Mediterranean further drained the instructor pool as the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain air superiority across multiple theaters, while Soviet forces ground down German strength in the east. By late 1942, the first significant cuts to training hours began. The Luftwaffe could no longer afford the luxury of comprehensive pilot education when operational units were bleeding pilots faster than the training schools could replace them. Fuel, always precious, was increasingly allocated to combat operations rather than training flights. The training organization became what German documents called the poor relation, receiving whatever resources remained after frontline demands were met. This logic made tactical sense in the short term, but proved catastrophic strategically. Every hour of training cut meant pilots arrived at operational units less prepared, which meant they were lost faster, which meant more pilots needed training, which meant training had to be shortened further to meet demand. The Luftwaffe had entered a vicious circle from which it would never escape. By early 1944, Luftwaffe fighter pilot training had been shortened to an average of 160 hours, compared to the well over 200 hours that had been standard just 2 years earlier. Allied training programs, meanwhile, maintained or even increased their standards. The average USAAF or RAF fighter pilot received approximately 225 hours of flight training, nearly 70% more than their German counterparts. As the gap widened, the quality of instruction continued its decline, creating a compounding effect that produced increasingly unprepared pilots arriving at combat units. The training accident rate began climbing to levels that shocked Luftwaffe leadership. Sometimes a third of each intake was lost before pilots even qualified for operational duty, wasting not only irreplaceable lives, but also aircraft that were desperately needed at the front. These accidents consumed aviation fuel that could have been used for combat operations and tied up maintenance personnel who were needed to service frontline aircraft. The entire system was grinding itself to pieces, yet operational demands left no alternative but to continue pushing pilots through an increasingly inadequate training pipeline. During the first half of 1944, Luftwaffe day fighter units defending Germany suffered catastrophic losses at the hands of better-trained American escort fighter pilots, flying P-51 Mustangs that could outperform the best German fighters then in service. The home defense units lost approximately 2,000 pilots, killed, missing, or wounded during these 6 months. German fighter units underwent a complete turnover of pilots roughly every 5 months, meaning that by mid-1944, most of the experienced pilots who had fought earlier in the war were dead or too badly wounded to fly. The few aces who remained alive carried impossible burdens, expected to train new pilots, lead formations, and achieve the kill ratios that had once been common, but were now nearly impossible against numerically superior and better-trained opponents. In the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe training system suffered a blow from which it could never recover when the B flight schools were disbanded entirely. Pilots were now sent directly into action with approximately 112 hours of total flight training, broken down into brutally inadequate stages. The school provided 2 hours of glider flying and 50 hours of powered flying on elementary types. Fighter school added another 40 hours. The replacement fighter group contributed a final 20 hours before pilots were considered ready for combat. The condition for receiving the A2 flight certificate, supposedly indicating basic competency, included just 15 hours of actual flight time. These numbers represented not training standards but desperation, masquerading as policy. The Luftwaffe also implemented the Windhund program, which attempted to convert ex-bomber pilots into fighter pilots by giving them just 20 hours of flying time in fighters. This program produced a stream of pilots who possessed neither the instinctive reactions nor the tactical understanding needed to survive combat against experienced Allied pilots. These converted bomber pilots were sent to units that expected them to engage P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts in dogfights they had no realistic chance of winning. Their predictably high casualty rates reflected the desperate nature of this expedient. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel production administered the final killing blow to whatever remained of the Luftwaffe training organization. During Big Week in February 1944, coordinated American and British raids systematically targeted German aviation fuel plants with devastating effect. By September 1944, an estimated 98% of Germany's aircraft fuel production capacity had been knocked out of operation. The loss of Romanian oil fields to the Soviet advance in September eliminated Germany's last major source of natural petroleum. The Luftwaffe entered the autumn of 1944, experiencing chronic fuel shortages that affected every aspect of operations. German fighter pilots returning from missions were ordered to switch off their engines immediately upon touching down to avoid wasting fuel, while ground crews quickly pushed aircraft under cover, using manpower rather than precious gasoline. In one of the war's more striking contrasts, the Luftwaffe began using teams of oxen to tow aircraft into position for takeoff. During September and October 1944, the Luftwaffe operated on approximately 10% of its fuel requirements, meaning that operational flights were severely curtailed and training flights became almost impossible. In September 1944, the Luftwaffe Flying Training Organization received what would prove to be its death blow. Elementary schools were closed first as fuel supplies dwindled below the minimum needed to maintain basic operations. Many specialist schools followed within weeks. As the last trainees passed through the surviving training programs, the specialist fighter schools were also disbanded, and their remaining instructors sent to frontline units where experienced pilots were needed to lead formations of inexperienced rookies. The training organization's output fell to just 30% of its theoretical monthly capacity. New pilots received no instruction in instrument flying, meaning they could not operate in poor weather, no tactical training beyond the most basic maneuvers, and were not taught formation flying, leaving them unable to coordinate effectively with wingmen or squadron mates. By February 1945, the Luftwaffe Aircrew Training Organization had, to all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. Germany still possessed factories producing aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1940. The dispersed production facilities hidden in forests and carved into mountainsides continued their work even as Allied armies approached German borders from east and west. But the pipelines that had once transformed teenage volunteers into skilled aviators had been severed completely. The few pilots still being produced emerged from training programs so abbreviated that they were barely capable of taking off and landing, much less engaging in combat with pilots who had hundreds of hours of experience. The practical consequences of this training collapse were visible in every engagement. German pilots were arriving at operational units with 50 to 100 hours of total flight time and being thrown into combat against Allied pilots who had accumulated 300 or more hours during training, plus additional experience from earlier missions. Rookie German pilots were frequently shot down on their first or second missions, sometimes without ever seeing the enemy fighter that killed them. Of the 107 German pilots ultimately credited with shooting down 100 or more enemy aircraft, only 8 entered frontline service after June 1942. This statistic reveals the complete failure of the wartime training system to produce pilots capable of achieving the success that pre-war and early war pilots had achieved routinely. The Luftwaffe compounded its training problems by refusing to implement a rotation system like those used by Allied air forces. American practice involved bringing successful pilots back from combat after a tour of duty to serve as instructors, passing their hard-won tactical knowledge to new pilots before returning to operations. The Luftwaffe kept veteran pilots on frontline duty continuously until they were killed or too badly wounded to fly. This policy meant that battle expertise was constantly being drained from the organization rather than preserved and passed on. German aces achieved higher individual kill counts than Allied aces, partly because they flew far more combat missions, but this came at the cost of institutional knowledge that could have saved lives if it had been systematically transferred to new pilots through proper instruction. The final proof of the training system's complete collapse came on January 1, 1945, when the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, its last major strategic offensive. German commanders assembled more than 850 fighters for a coordinated surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. The operation achieved tactical surprise and destroyed approximately 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, a seemingly impressive result that briefly raised German morale. But the operation proved catastrophic in ways that sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. Germany lost 271 fighters during the operation, yet the far more devastating loss was the pilot casualties. Sources vary, but the most thorough accounting suggests 143 pilots were lost as killed or missing, with another 70 captured and 21 wounded. More than 60 of these were experienced formation leaders and veteran pilots whose loss could not be replaced. Many fell to German anti-aircraft fire because security for the operation had been so tight that German flak units had not been informed of the mission and shot down their own aircraft. The Allies replaced their lost aircraft within a week because American factories were producing replacement fighters faster than combat could consume them. Allied pilot casualties were minimal because most losses were aircraft destroyed on the ground rather than aircrew lost in combat. The Germans, conversely, had lost pilots they could not replace no matter how many aircraft their factories produced. Operation Bodenplatte represented the largest single-day loss in Luftwaffe history, and the fighter force never recovered its strength or effectiveness. In the remaining 17 weeks of the war, the Luftwaffe struggled to mount anything beyond token resistance, while Allied bombers operated over Germany with near impunity, and Allied fighters dominated the skies during the Rhine crossings and the final invasion of Germany itself. The story of the Luftwaffe's pilot training collapse reveals a fundamental truth about modern warfare that production statistics alone cannot capture. Germany had the aluminum needed to build aircraft, and its factories, despite constant bombing, continued producing fighters until the war's final weeks. German engineers designed jets and rockets that represented genuine technological advances. None of this mattered, because air power ultimately depends on the people operating the machines rather than the machines themselves. Building an aircraft takes months, but training a competent pilot takes years. Germany sacrificed its training infrastructure to maintain short-term operational strength, a decision that guaranteed long-term defeat. The fuel crisis certainly accelerated the training system's collapse, but the underlying problem was organizational and strategic. The Luftwaffe entered the war with a training system designed to maintain a stable force structure, not to replace casualties at the rate imposed by multi-front warfare against opponents with superior industrial capacity. When the system began showing strain in 1942, German leadership responded by cutting training standards rather than reducing operational tempo or withdrawing from theaters where the Luftwaffe could not maintain superiority. Every such decision made sense in isolation, but contributed to a cumulative catastrophe that became irreversible by 1944. The final year of the war saw the paradox reach its most absurd expression. Airfields across Germany held hundreds of brand new fighters that would never fly in combat because there were no pilots trained to fly them. The Me-262 jet fighter, technically superior to any Allied aircraft, saw limited service partly because of production difficulties, but also, based on operational records, because Germany lacked sufficient pilots with the skill to master its demanding flight characteristics. The few experienced pilots who flew the jets achieved impressive results, but their small numbers meant they could never affect the war's outcome. American and British pilots flew their technically inferior conventional fighters with confidence born from hundreds of hours of training, while German pilots flew superior aircraft with inadequate preparation that often proved fatal. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, its aircraft industry had produced more fighters in 1944 alone than it had in any previous year of the war, with production continuing into early 1945. These numbers represented a genuine industrial achievement accomplished under devastating bombing campaigns, and with a labor force that included forced workers and concentration camp prisoners. Yet this production success only emphasized the catastrophic failure of the training system. Each new aircraft rolling off the assembly line highlighted the absent pilots who should have been flying them. The empty cockpits told the real story of the Luftwaffe's defeat more clearly than any production statistic or combat loss report. The lesson transcended the specific circumstances of World War II Germany. Air superiority, indeed military superiority in general, depends on institutional capacity to train personnel as much as on capacity to produce equipment. Hardware without trained operators represents potential rather than actual capability. Cutting training standards to meet immediate operational demands creates a death spiral where inadequately trained personnel die faster, creating even greater demand for replacements that must be rushed through even more inadequate training. Breaking this spiral requires withdrawing from some operations to preserve training capacity, a decision that is politically and psychologically difficult, but strategically essential. In 1944, the Luftwaffe built approximately 4,600 aircraft, while its training schools produced only a fraction of the pilots needed to fly them effectively. This imbalance determined the war's outcome in the skies over Germany as surely as any battle. When the last German fighters sat silent on their airfields in May 1945, they stood as monuments to a fundamental miscalculation. German leadership had understood that modern war required industrial capacity, but they failed to grasp that industrial capacity meant more than factories and raw materials. It meant the ability to train personnel at the same rate you could produce equipment. Without that parallel capacity, every aircraft built represented not strength, but waste. The empty cockpits weren't just a symbol of defeat, but proof that in mechanized warfare, the machine is worthless without the trained hand to operate it.